11 years before he set pen to paper to write the Declaration of Independence, a very important acquisition in his library was a copy of the Quran. And the copy of the Quran is there with all of his marginalia and all of his notations. And perhaps it underscores really the value of civil dialogue and how the founding fathers thought about religious pluralism and universal citizenship. And here at the Aspen Institute, we are no strangers to bringing people together with different religious and political and ideological backgrounds to discuss the very important issues of society and to realize that we have more in common than not. In 1949, when we debuted our great book seminar at Aspen with Mortimer Adler, the Quran was a part of the original text. So you were reading Locke and reading Rousseau and Hobbes, excerpts from the Quran, excerpts from Corinthians and from the Psalms and Proverbs, and then people would sit around a table and actually talk about how those ideas inform our sense of economy, efficiency, productivity, liberty, and justice. And those dialogues continue in the great book sessions and seminars that we do at the Aspen Institute, but they continue in the everyday work that we do here in the Aspen Institute by bringing people together to try to find common ground as we look towards taking on and coming up with viable solutions to very complex issues that we face in society. So this is a continuation of that great dialogue, and I'd like to congratulate Meryl Chertoff and her entire team for the hard work that they've done in Justice and Society and producing this wonderful book, Pluralism and Peril. And I think if there's a more important time for us to collectively reflect on those ideals of Americanism and pluralism, it's now. So Meryl, thank you very much for organizing this. Thank you all for being here and continuing to help us to perpetuate this type of conversation. Thank you. Take your next. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Motley. I'm going to take a step up here. Okay. Whoop. Hi. Good morning, everybody. And I want to welcome you to the new offices of the Aspen Institute. You are one of the first groups to be here. This is maybe the first report that has come out in this new building, Pluralism in Peril. I encourage everybody to take copies with you when you leave today, and it will be available online as well. I am the executive director of the Justice and Society program at the Aspen Institute, one of the oldest programs at the Aspen Institute. Since 2011, we have led a project called the Inclusive America Project to explore how to constructively engage America's religious pluralism. A couple of people that I want to thank today. I particularly want to thank some of the members of our distinguished panel for the Inclusive America Project who've made a special effort to be here today. David Little, Wayne Firestone, and we expect Rabbi David Saperstein. So we want to thank you all very much for your leadership and your vision. Madeline Albright and David Gergen, the co-chairs of our distinguished panel, were not able to be with us here today, but we are grateful to them for their leadership throughout this process. They tasked us in 2016 to create this report prior to the presidential election, but certainly made even more urgent in the months that have come afterwards. I also want to thank and acknowledge the support of the Carnegie Corporation in producing this report, and especially the El Hebri Foundation. And we're delighted that today we're joined by Farhan Latif, Maka Ali, and Maggie Siddiqui, our good colleagues from the El Hebri Foundation. And I thank you all for being here. E pluribus unum, out of many one. This is the American creed. Have we been perfect in this? No. But one of the things that makes the U.S. unique is that we have always held this up as an ideal. And we've done more than pay it lip service. We've made it our work. That's why we've called this book Pluralism in Peril, because today pluralism is under attack. What's the difference between tolerance and pluralism? Tolerance, toleration, that's what you exhibit for your crazy uncle at Thanksgiving dinner. Tolerance is a thin concept. It means that we live side by side with minimal interaction. And it works as long as times are good. It's a thin form of civic fabric. When times are challenging, tolerance isn't enough. We need pluralism, a thick form of engagement where we do more than just sit side by side. Some people have asked me about this report. Well, what are you asking for? Are you just asking for everybody to love each other? We don't need to love each other. We do need to understand each other. And through that understanding, we'll see that we are much more the same than we are different. So this report, Principled Pluralism, provides practical advice for creating opportunities for appreciative encounter, sustained dialogue, and curiosity through which the other becomes the neighbor. And I want to also remark, before talking about some of the specifics in the essay, something extraordinary which has happened this week in Washington. And that's another of the many meetings that are going on in Washington this week. It's the Alliance of Virtue meeting that took place in Washington this week. And this was a gathering of leaders from around the Muslim world, both people from outside of the United States and leaders in the US, along with Christian and Jewish leaders. And it grew out of the Marrakesh Declarations, which was a declaration in the Muslim world of tolerance for non-Muslim minorities in Muslim countries. There was a follow-on meeting on this over the last 2 days, remarkable conversations, and particularly remarkable that these leaders chose to do it here in the United States, because it indicates that we remain a beacon for the world on religious freedom. Tomorrow morning is the National Prayer Breakfast, and we would hope that at the National Prayer Breakfast there will be a reciprocal declaration of tolerance and inclusion for Muslims in the United States. Let me talk a little bit about pluralism in Peril. We've got 3 long essays, and they touch on some critical issues. One is allyship by our good colleague Brie Lascota. It's on how to advocate for and build bridges across difference without appropriating or stifling the authentic voices of minority communities. We also have an essay on resilience by our good colleague Sarah Morgenthau, who's here, so that in crisis, the majority community doesn't lash out, so that when attacked, minorities are able to bounce back, and so that everyone understands that an attack on one is an attack on all. That's our solidarity. The third essay is on youth services and schools and the opportunities that there are for education on basic concepts of religious literacy there and opportunities for interaction. This returns to a theme of our earlier report in 2013, Principled Pluralism. We believe that some of the best opportunities lie with youth, and that the opportunities to create appreciative understanding can take place in WISE, in Boys and Girls Clubs, in 4-H clubs, in camps. Both opportunities that are woven into the curriculum and opportunities that take place when groups engage with each other, whether it's on the basketball court, in a computer lab, in camp jamborees that bring groups together that are from different parts of a community or different parts of a state. All of these are opportunities for interaction. And those one-off interactions are good and very positive. But what we really hope that they'll do is it will lead to the kind of sustained relationships that create what has been called the My Pal Al phenomenon. And My Pal Al is, according to the authors of a study at Harvard, the My Pal Al phenomenon is where if you have a friend named Al, and Al is from another faith, if you have a regular friendship and correspondence with Al, not only will you be less biased against Al, but you will be less biased in general. So that will extend your network and your vision of what constitutes your neighbor and what constitutes your friend. So we want to create my pal Al relationships around the country. Now, we also talk about the role of government. And there was a time that the federal government took a lead in this work. Today, of course, the federal government is not taking a leadership role in encouraging interaction between people from different groups. So that this work now has to come from civil society. It has to come from church groups and synagogue groups. It has to come from mosques. It has to come from youth service organizations, from municipalities, from counties, and from states. It needs to be local. And so we're asking today for a commitment from every civil society organization in America. We're asking everyone to do something, and we're asking some to make an extended commitment. And particularly, we are asking for an extended commitment to building religious pluralism from cities, states, youth service organizations, and philanthropy. And I wanted to say a few words on philanthropy. There's an essay on philanthropy in the book, and it's primarily about building internal capacity. That is, how Muslim communities are able to build internal capacity for philanthropy. We're grateful to the El Hebrew Foundation as being one of the leaders in this area. But we're asking for something beyond that. We're also asking for a commitment from major philanthropies to re-examine their commitment to issues that center around religion and building civil society with the religious lens as part of that commitment. We think that philanthropies have missed a great bet here because for many people, their religious identity is a primary pole of identity. And so while the major philanthropies talk a lot about race, as they should, and talk a lot about immigration status, as they should, we think that they also need to be thinking about how people identify around religion and how we can engage with each other across religious difference. I think that there has been some promising discussions that we have become aware of. We hope that a commitment will be made in this area in the years to come. Extremism. Two of our essays talk about extremism, and they talk about it in the context of attacks on religious minorities. As you probably read in the paper, there had been a growth in 2017 in bias attacks on both Muslims and Jews. There's been a lot of online recruiting, both by right-wing groups and by ISIS and ISIS-affiliated organizations. Two of our essays talk about the similarity between right-wing and violent jihadi extremism and extremist recruiting, and the need to grow tools that will fight that, but more important, how to inoculate communities so that, like a healthy body, they can reject infection by extremism. This is also a ripe area for further exploration. The third part of the book is a vision for 2028, and it includes a series of personal reflections where people talk about their faith or their political commitment to pluralism in the Trump era. And this includes essays by Republicans, by conservative, or also known as evangelical Christians, by mainline Christian groups, by an Orthodox Jewish campus chaplain, and by the founder of the largest interfaith campus service organization in the U.S., the Interfaith Youth Corps, and he is an Ismaili Muslim. We end with resources on best practice models and further reading. And we want to see these recommendations and best practice models examined and adopted one community at a time around the nation. That's my vision for 2028. And with that, I'd like to turn it over to my colleague, Zianat Rahman, who is the director of the Inclusive America Project, and a panel which she'll lead. Come on up.
Ron wouldn't want to sit next to me.
I know. I was hoping it would be you.
Good morning, everybody. My name is Zinat Rahman, and I'm the project director of the Inclusive America Project. I wanted to say Pluralism and Peril because it's such a mouthful, but of the Inclusive America Project. And it's so great to see all of you here. And in my life, like I feel like this is the die-hard group of people who really care about this issue, some of whom I've worked with at Interfaith Youth Corps when I was there, some at USAID, some at the State Department, and now here at the Aspen Institute. And I'm so lucky to be joined by these three gentlemen who I've known for over a decade because we've all worked in the space for that long. Let me start by introducing them. To my immediate left is Dr. Chris Seipel, who's the executive director of the Sage Stone Group and president emeritus of the Institute for Global Engagement, which is a research, education, and diplomatic institution that builds sustainable religious freedom worldwide through local partnerships. He's a graduate of Stanford, the Naval Postgraduate School, and Fletcher. He's also the founder of the Review of Faith and International Affairs, a senior fellow at the Foreign Policy Research Institute, and a member of the International Institute for Strategic Studies. And there's like a page more, but I'm not gonna go into it. To his left is George Salim, who's the senior vice president of programs at the Anti-Defamation League. In this role, he leads the ADL's education, law enforcement, and community security programs, and oversees the work of ADL's Center on Extremism. That's a new job for you. Prior to that, George served in the administrations of Presidents Bush, Obama, and Trump, and he most recently served at the Department of Homeland Security's as the Department of Homeland Security's Director of the Office for Community Partnerships. He spent 4 years at the White House on the NSC staff. Before that, he was at the DHS Office of Civil Rights and Civil Liberties, and originally from Ohio. Nice to have you. And all the way to the end is Farhan Latif, who is the president of the Al Hebri Foundation. He works with the Al Hebri Foundation Board of Trustees and staff to define and implement the foundation's long-range vision, goals, and strategies and policies, which you're going to tell us a little bit more about in a little bit. He previously served as Chief Operating Officer and Director of Policy at the Institute for Social Policy and Understanding. Prior to that, he spent over a decade in higher education, working at the intersection of building a culture of philanthropy and enabling access for underrepresented, low-income, and first-generation students, and originally a Michigander. So each one of you sit and have sat in different institutions and have been working in this space, as I mentioned, for a long time. Our report is called Pluralism in Peril because, as Meryl outlined, we felt that this critical this ideal of American ideal of religious pluralism, the value of e pluribus unum, out of many one, is being threatened in a way that feels unique right now. And so I'd like to have each of you start and take a few minutes to offer a landscape analysis on where we are in the current moment, and just what are your thoughts today? So Chris, I'll start with you.
Well, thank you. And thanks for coming out today. I was remarking to Farhan about this new space before we began. If you're in the business that we're in, peace architecture, the literal and physical space where you meet, it's a big deal. And to be here and on a gloomy day, but to feel open and transparent and have the light, I mean, that's just fantastic. To have a view, to have a vision, I mean, these things are literal. And they make a difference in terms of how you engage, and congratulations on this wonderful space. In terms of the moment, having worked at an organization called the Institute for Global Engagement, let me take maybe the global perspective and then come back to America. But I think we're amidst a global phenomenon, and the global phenomenon would be one of, for lack of a better term, religious nationalism. And a religious nationalism that is defined against the minority, and depending on the personality who is in charge in places like Turkey or Russia or Philippines, China, it's the same phenomenon. And so what is the response to religious nationalism where you're being defined against? And I think the response can only be one of faithful patriotism. And I'm a big fan of saying only the best of faith defeats the worst of religion. Well, what does that mean? Well, you have to know your own scripture at its best in order to speak against the extremism that might result where religion is used to validate violence against the other. Because it's not a function of a particular faith tradition, it's a function, at least in my mind, of the human condition. Religion is used to validate the power of the majority and take your pick. It's happening in Myanmar too, by the way, these days. So you have to think about that. And to think about that, then you have to have a concept of citizenship, which was mentioned in the introduction. I think there is a spiritual and global and national citizenship, all of which are to be stewarded by each individual and to think through what that means. And one may have more allegiance or priority over the others. For people of faith, I happen to be a Christian, the faith is always going to be the first priority. I'm a Christian who happens to be an American. And I think I'm called to live out those values. I can go into what that means and what that means for loving the other. But the bottom line is, if my faith says love God, love neighbor, and love enemy, it sucks to be me. Love God, love neighbor, and love enemy. That's the way it goes. So you got to figure that out. And what does it look like? So maybe I'll stop there as a broad backdrop about where we are. But clearly we need some more loving going on, but there's got to be some more practicality about how that engagement is done. And that it brings everybody to the table, and why the Aspen Institute and why this particular forum is so important.
Thank you, Chris. George?
Thank you. And thank you, Zinat and Meryl and the rest of the team from the Aspen Institute for convening this get-together today. And just to hold up the book one more time here, this is a tremendous collection of thoughts and efforts and initiatives by a tremendous group of individuals who all contributed to this in some way. So I'm thrilled to be a part of this with a lot of other people that I have both learned from and been inspired from along their both personal and professional journeys. So thank you for letting me be a part of this and share some small thoughts. Picking up on several of the points that Chris made, and Zinat, to your question in terms of where we are today, you heard from my introduction that up until recently, I worked in the federal government for the better part of a dozen years. And I've now been in the NGO sector in a new role at the Anti-Defamation League for just over 5 months now. And irrespective of what the headlines of the nightly news may say, and irrespective of what commitments will or won't be made at the National Prayer Breakfast this week, I think my analysis of where we are is an opportunity, or rather a view, that we are at a time where the best of civil society, where the best of religions, and where the best of pluralism can shine through. I found in my own path the opportunity to leave government and join a civil society organization, one that invests in community building, one that brings diverse groups together on a regular basis, and one that has a vision to continue doing this work as it has been doing for over 100 years, is something that I'm optimistic about. And while there may be a number of headlines on the news on a day-to-day basis that give us reason to be more than pessimistic, what you see is plenty of reasons to be optimistic, whether it's underdogs in the Super Bowl context coming up on top, or wins when you see the best of humanity kind of rise up against hatred and bigotry in places like Charlottesville, Virginia, and other places across the country. And the most simple acts of kindness, whether it's during a Jewish, Muslim, or Christian kind of faith holiday or religious ceremony, these types of acts of coming together that I'm reminded of in this publication, this is the best of society here. It's not whether or not the stock market is up or down a certain number of points. It's the acts of humanity that really bind people together and that bring the scholarship in this book together and really give us more reason and more charge to take this work and move it forward. So in terms of where we are today, the saying that the one thing you can always count on in your life, either personally or professionally, is failure and adversity. It's a given. You will always find that. But in terms of where we are today, the glass half full approach on that is that I am optimistic in terms of where we are today, and that irrespective of how challenging and how failing the times will be in front of us, there will always be an opportunity to do what's right, both morally and ethically, as a humanity and as an American people.
Thank you, George. Farhan?
Thank you, Zinat. I also want to start by thanking Meryl, the Inclusive America Project, Zinat, Allison, and the team of people that have really championed this topic and this issue and worked on this report. And I agree with what George mentioned, that this report, in many ways, as it was being compiled, I feel the convenings informed the work that was happening in the sector. And so you could see it happen as it was going on. And at the same time, I believe that we're informed by what's in the report. So it was a really good partnership and combination. And going back to the question of the landscape, I think things are pretty bad. And that comes to as no surprise to anyone. The hate crime stats are up in an unprecedented level that we have seen. We are seeing mosques being burned to ashes, graffiti on synagogues, death threat phone calls, and I've had a chance actually to visit these places across the country and see the impacted communities, and it's terrifying for people. Visiting an Islamic school where my mother teaches, and to see her shield her kids in a Montessori when a truck pulls up and stares everyone down. Like, this is not a great climate, and condition to be in. And so it has been very challenging in the last year, especially, and moving ahead. Our own landscape analysis that we conducted at the foundation, we asked the question around inclusion. 350 different organizations across the country responded to that, provided a needs assessment. We found two things. One, that there are, the challenges that we're seeing or hearing about, the stats that we're reading, they're really, really bad. When you hear about the conditions in communities and the things that people are facing, the challenges seem surmountable. Like, it's very hard to deal with what's happening. But on the other hand, the other takeaway we had was this fresh approach and ideas and leaders that are emerging at this time to take on these challenges and to provide some solutions and to see some more intersectional movement building work that's happening, and for alliances to be forming that have not formed previously. And so that, going back to this idea of fear and hope, we see that along the same lines. And finally, from a philanthropic lens, I agree with Meryl's comments that, look, there's a lot of conversation that is happening around the urgency of this time and for philanthropy to play a catalytic role in the process. But sometimes it's not fast enough. Sometimes there's more discussion, not enough action. And although we've seen some early adopters in the process that have come out and taken charge, and we have some partners in the room that we work with here, there needs to be more that's done. So,
Great. I have some individual questions directed towards each of you. So, Chris, I'm just going to start with you, and about the evangelical community. That there appears to be a split, with many strongly in favor of religious pluralism as foundational to their own beliefs, as you kind of mentioned, while others are in favor of maybe putting up walls between religions, arguably in the name of national security. And so, can you help us understand these diametrically opposite views among evangelicals, and what's the way forward to bridge the gap amongst evangelicals and then, with the broader community even?
Well,
Small
thank
charge.
you. Yeah, for that softball. Well, I obviously ascribe to the label evangelical. My wife does not. And we love each other. And that doesn't mean she's any less of a Christian. But the reason she does not is she gets tired, as many people in the Christian community, evangelical or otherwise, or outside the Christian community, of a stereotype that has some truth about evangelicals being political, strident, and unforgiving sometimes. And I think that can be true of any tradition. Certainly true of our tradition. I tend to think that they are the louder voices. I tend to think that sometimes I differentiate between capital E and lowercase e evangelicals. I would put myself as a lowercase e, which is to say, hopefully winsome and engaging the world as it is, not sugarcoating anything. Farhan is exactly right. There are very serious situations out there. Hate speech contributes to those things. But I still accept the label, because the label, in its etymology, means good news, and I believe in the good news. And I think to have a perspective on that, I think it's useful to say, okay, what is the Christian awareness or thinking about pluralism? And how are we commanded to think about it? When Jesus' birth is announced, it's to the lowliest people, it's the shepherds, the outcasts. When Jesus announces who he is, he announces to someone who is not the Romans or the religious establishment. He announces himself to a half-breed heathen harlot in midday. This is the woman at the well, the Samaritan in John 4. And he uses the language of I am, which is the language of the burning bush in Exodus 3:14. He's making an exclusive truth claim, but he is inviting everybody to the conversation. When the tomb is revealed as empty, it's two women. Jewish law required two witnesses, and it's not the guys. They're bailing. They're afraid. So if you're a Christian, back to my earlier comment, you got to do as Jesus does. Love God, love neighbor, love enemy. So I think that is the profound organizing principle for what the faith is and how Americans, at least in my experience with those evangelicals, that is where they want to be, and they want to have honest conversations. To be sure, there are real concerns about immigration and those kinds of things, but it's not the what, it's the how it's done. That's got to be the most important part about how you engage. My last comment here in terms of faith and policy is Eric in the opening mentioned the Founding Fathers. And there are some movements to demonstrate that the Founding Fathers were all, of course, good evangelicals, which is not true. They were deists. And the person that I look to is Roger Williams. Because Roger Williams demonstrates the best of faith against the worst of religion. He fled the soft theocracy of Massachusetts, which would end up hanging Quakers in 1660 and 63 because they were against the majority religious establishment. Roger Williams, as a function of reading his faith in the scriptures, invited Quakers in, invited Native American, well, they were already there. He bought the land from them, by the way. And the first Jewish synagogue is in Newport, Rhode Island. So it's a totally different thing. And I think that's the choice that's always before us. Are we going to be Massachusetts and have a majority that defines according to whatever its faith group is? And again, this gets back to religious nationalism. It's a global phenomenon. Or are we going to be Rhode Island? And nothing against Massachusetts. I'm a Pats fan, etc. Red Sox fan. But I went to high school in Philly. I can claim all the tribes. But we got to make that choice. We got to make that choice. And that's the advantage of this opportunity, as George was saying earlier. The Chinese have a character that means danger and opportunity. The great disruption that we are experiencing is that we have an opportunity to have honest conversations about faith, about race, and about gender. And I think that's a blessing. But we have to seize it.
Can I push on that a little and just,
Yeah.
so if this is a moment of opportunity, is there an aperture for this conversation within the evangelical community?
Oh,
and
yeah.
as a Muslim, I hate it when people, will paint with a broad brush. So I hate to say it. Can you tell us about the evangelical community? But are there conversations percolating that are different than what's maybe happened in the last decade? And
Sorry, I should
what
have
are
been
those?
practical. I'm a former Marine infantry guy, so if it's not concrete, you can't do it. Two examples. One would be Bob Roberts, who is a Southern Baptist evangelical of evangelicals from East Texas. He is part of this Alliance for Virtue, and with David Saperstein and others, Imam Majid, they're getting folks together to have conversations, and younger pastors in the evangelical movement are reacting to that because it's like giving them permission to live out their faith in an authentic way and love neighbor. But here's the important part, and I sometimes differentiate between interfaith and multi-faith. Neither word is bad or good, but interfaith for some in the evangelical community is like touchy-feely, all roads lead to heaven, let's go hug a tree. All watered down. Multi-faith says, you know what, we believe there's eternal consequences for how we regard the eternal and how we believe. And we want to be able to talk about that because that's the essence of our identity. And we want to bring that to the table, to the public policy discussion, and we want you to bring the same. We can't be checking this at the door. And that's what Roger Williams did back in Rhode Island. The second example is there's a press conference at 11:30 today. Senator Lankford, no Democrat, no liberal, with the Evangelical Immigration Roundtable. Look what they're doing on immigration. That's what I would choose to affiliate with, and that's what I would say is actually the silent majority of lowercase e evangelicals in this country who are not defined by the louder voices.
Thank you. Okay, so Jared, a recurrent theme throughout the book, in all the different essays and chapters, is this idea that civil society is where the change is going to happen. And for over the past decade, you've worked in this space, first at DHS, as we said, and now at the ADL. And in your essay as well, you write about the government's capacity as being limited in whether it's countering extremism or just being effective at this work or being an effective messenger for this work. What have you seen that's effective kind of at the NGO civil society level, but also there's an inordinate amount of pressure on civil society organizations right now for the multitude of challenges that we face. How do we navigate the way where we're putting so much pressure on these organizations that are very strapped in a sense?
Great question. A few thoughts. The first is that as we think about this space, and as we try to navigate the complexity, I think of both the American political environment and things that come out day to day, whether it's immigration, the economy, or some new issue. I think there are a few things to keep in mind. Number one is, while civil society is indeed challenged in this regard, civil society has stepped up to these issues, and I think there's a long history within American history and really across the globe in different communities of stepping up to this challenge as well. I mean, we've seen great examples of this in many different places, which I'll get to in a second. One of the key points to your question that makes, in regard to the government's capacity on this, is the theme of credibility or authenticity. Whether or not it's resources in the form of grants or dollars like the philanthropic sector can provide, what is the credibility or authenticity when the federal government, in the case of the United States, or a central government elsewhere across the globe, provides resources to civil society and can be somewhat directive or controlling on those. That's a credibility and authenticity issue. I am personally of the belief that our American government should be more forward-leaning in this space. And there is an opportunity for convening and catalyzing work within civil society that uniquely only the federal government can do. Having that said, that credibility, authenticity, or those resources can only go so far. The ability for multi-faith groups, the ability for civil society actors, the ability and the power of young people, whether they're from the Interfaith Youth Corps or elsewhere, to come together can catalyze far more change than any number of governments that can come together in any room, whether it's in the U.S., whether it's in the UN, in New York, or elsewhere across the globe. So I think the power of people is really insurmountable against, or rather the face of the challenge is not insurmountable against the power of young people and against the power of civil society institutions when they come together on these issues. I think the government can and should continue to have a very involved role here. But I think civil society in the U.S. has proven in American history. I think civil society has proven, as we've seen across the Middle East, through and about and after the Arab Spring, through Western Europe, post-World War II and elsewhere. I think there's a great story that civil society has overcome extremely challenging points in history, irrespective of the actions that central or federal governments have taken. And at times when governments and civil society can partner and can join together for mutually achievable goals, I think that's the best that any country, including our own, has to offer on that regard.
Thank you. This is a good segue. I didn't plan it this way, but Farhan, I want you to talk a little bit more about the work of Al-Hibri, because I think people don't know it, and I think it's important. So the Al-Hibri Foundation uniquely focuses on building the capacity of American Muslim nonprofit leaders through nonprofit capacity building, collaboration, and leadership. And so I'd like you to talk about why you made the decision for this to be the focus, and how that work that you do helps strengthen American pluralism. But also in your opening remarks, you had mentioned that you did a needs assessment of 350 organizations. So, I invite you to be granular and talk to us about what on the ground, the organization is seeing and kind of the trend lines around that.
Sure. Thank you, Zinat, for that. So the Al Hibri Foundation is a foundation based here in DC, focused on inclusion. It was started by an American Muslim family. The family is an immigrant family that moved to America, did well, lived the American dream, and now is giving back. And that's kind of how it informs our work, that we feel that if more people have an equal shot at achieving the American dream, it allows them to unleash their God-given potential and become contributors to society in the best shape and form. Of course, now we see that the barriers to entry to achieving that are becoming very high, and there's the challenges that are coming way. There's more marginalization and less, access to equitable ways of participation, which of course impact the democracy and society. So our foundation, after conducting this needs assessment across the country, came to the conclusion that at this given time, our focus has to be positioned to really provide resources, capacity, grants, technical support to leaders of the American Muslim community to work in partnership with allies to focus on inclusion. I'll give you, in this report, there's this quote that I think was by Bree, where she talked about this idea that, right now the American Muslim community is a community which the term itself brings about a lot of fear, misunderstanding. And Bree pointed that, you cannot build trust as a community builder if you are not, in fact, being heard. Last week or so marked a year since the executive order around the Muslim ban. And when you started to watch on CNN and other channels the response or the conversation around this topic, what we found and other researchers have found is that majority of the people that were on TV that were talking about these issues were people who were not impacted by this executive order. So the members of the community that actually have to deal with this are not there, are not present. And so that's a real challenge. And so our hope is to amplify the leadership, amplify the voices in the leadership, provide grants. We focus on leadership development, storytelling, public narrative, organizing, so that that shift can happen. And another piece to be understood right now when looking at the sector, you talked about the needs assessment, is that when you survey, and you'll find more about this in Sharik's article in the book, in Dalia's article in the book, and so on, is that when you do an assessment of the community, the American Muslim community makes up 1% to 2% of the American population. And in terms of civil society, the organization's average operating budget was less than $300,000, with 2.5 staff members trying to take on national challenges. So every time there's a national calamity or something happens and you're asking for a response of this community is represented by 2.5 people institutionally trying to take on these surmountable challenges. So that seems to be a great issue. And the last point I would make on this is that as a foundation, we're really trying to promote allyship. This is a great time for people to step up and provide that support and create avenues for that partnership. Because I feel that all these issues around inclusion are so interconnected. They say that Islamophobia is a leaf on the tree of racism. You have to start looking at what the connections are on this thing. I feel if this allyship is provided, not only will it help uplift this community that's being targeted, but it will also create more partnerships with other communities that are going through this process. The Muslim community is described as the canary in the coal mine, and whatever they're impacted by, others will be impacted by as well. So that's kind of what we're doing as a foundation, and I have to say that we're working in partnership with other groups and other funders, but more has to be done.
So Meryl, in her opening comments, spoke about this phenomenon of my pal al, that if you build interpersonal relationships with somebody of a different background, it reduces prejudice against that entire group for you. And that's like a critical node in how we change, hearts and minds and civil society. So in a place like DC or Chicago, where or many of the metropolitan centers where we're from, it's easy to find that heterogeneity amongst different religious groups. How do we begin to do these dialogues in more rural or homogenous areas, and particularly without putting kind of an overburden on the part of the religious minority groups? With such small percentages of like Muslims in America or even Jews in America, it's not realistic to think that everybody's going to meet a Muslim, as we say. And so how do we do that? How do we do that in a country that's so big, that has a lot of, middle area that just doesn't have the diversity that we have in other places? Chris?
Sure, great question. I referenced Bob Roberts earlier, and part of what he does is if you're going to be a part of his program, if you're a rabbi, a pastor, or an imam, you've got to eat together, and that's where relationships start. But then B, you've got to go back to your city and do something together. Be seen in public together. And I think that is absolutely the building block or cornerstone of how to engage our current situation right now. Because you're right, majority faith, ethnic group does not have access, the further you go away from urban centers, for the opportunity to be in friendship with Muslims or Jews if you're a Christian. So how do you enable that? The other sort of long-term thing is we need to think about literacy. And for me, there's three types of literacy. One, there has to be a scriptural literacy, which is to say you have to know your own faith at its deepest and richest best to engage. And if you take this stuff seriously, it's not like those earlier Bible verses that I was throwing out at you. It's not like I knew that 10, 15 years ago. I had to think through, what do I believe and why? The second kind of literacy is religious literacy, which is to say I have to know my own faith at its own deepest and richest best, scriptural literacy, in order to know enough about my neighbor's faith, not to tolerate it, but to respect it. And then the third, and this is something I'm exploring at the University of Washington, where I teach a course called cross-cultural religious literacy. What does that mean? Well, for me at least, I made up the term, so it can mean anything you want to mean, but it says you have to understand your own faith and another person's faith, but then you've got to work together to execute with excellence. And you're going to do that in a cross-cultural context, which is a whole nother dimension, because faith becomes a religion, faith becomes a culture, and sometimes people are cultural Christians and maybe not scriptural Christians, but that's true of any tradition. How do you delineate? How does that vary by ethnic group? If you talk to the black church in America and the white church in America about suffering, that's a cross-cultural experience, because you have two different responses. So the whole point about cross-cultural religious literacy is there's an element of specific skill sets, and then there's an element of getting from A to B, the former Marine in me. You got to get from A to B in the cold light of day, or it's just another touchy-feely talk, which is fine, but I'm interested in getting from A to B. So what are those skills? I'll end here. The way I've been thinking about this, all my experience overseas in very complicated places throughout Asia, all the skill sets boil down to this. One is evaluation, which is I have to be able to evaluate myself in the context, which includes the people that are not like me. Where are they at? How are they thinking about this? What do they believe? Et cetera, et cetera. The second is communication, which is verbal and nonverbal. And the third is negotiation. Everything in life is negotiation. You're always negotiating your identity, your reputation's going up or down, especially in a context that you don't know you're encountering for the first time. If we can begin to think about skill sets, and maybe they're the wrong words, maybe they're the wrong buckets, but if we can get into skill sets that intentionally equip people for this, then it's a different game, as opposed to, we just all get along. And can these skill sets be taught K through 12? And in universities and graduate programs, and in our diplomacy, and with our military? That's where we need to go, because those relationships at the end of the day are what make an effort sustainable. If there's no relationship, it's not going to exist past the grant. And we need to make this sustainable. It needs to take on local roots. I'll stop there.
No, it was great, and I like the concreteness. I invite you to also be concrete. Go ahead.
So, I'll pick up on a point that I saw, a theme, or perhaps a virtue rather, that I saw consistently throughout government, and that I see in the NGO space, and that I'm starting to understand in the philanthropic world, and that you may have seen in your travels across the globe working on these issues, which is irrespective of the faith tradition, irrespective of the form of government, irrespective of the capacity, whether it's 2.5 or 1.5, a $300,000 budget or a $300 budget, one of the key differentiating principles is the ability to demonstrate leadership on a situation, in a position, in a country, in a community, within a faith tradition. It's how do you set your guidance? How do you set your compass? Where do you put down the marker for this is the position where I think we need to go and where we need to go together? And then how do you organize people in that direction? And what I saw in government in the public policy space around extremism, on civil rights, on homeland or national security issues was not always the best articulation of leadership in that regard. And the true leaders in this space, many of them are still in and around government and supportive of people who are in government, demonstrated that type of leadership trait, demonstrated the ability to take counsel, to take wisdom, to take advice, and help put down a marker for how to build kind of coalitions behind. And I feel like irrespective of the ethnic or religious minority group that I've seen across the globe, or the ability on civil society or in philanthropy to make an influence or an impact on a space, it's not the dollars or the people ultimately that you need behind you to get this started. It's the ability to clearly and in an articulate way demonstrate leadership characteristics for the ability to organize, cast a vision, and be clear and focused in, as you called it, in the A to B space. And unless and until I think we can get there in a communal way, we're still going to struggle with the, I'm not sure I agree with that word, or multi-faith, interfaith, we're going to disagree on definitional issues. I think, this product is part of demonstrating leadership in a particular space. Thought leadership, intellectual leadership, scholarship that's been demonstrated from different perspectives. And unless and until organizations can get behind and not always need to be the leader, but okay with getting behind the leadership of another, I think in the public policy space and in the issues that we're talking about here today, more broadly for the role that pluralism can play, I think leading from a place of understanding and harnessing the power of pluralism is an incredible opportunity that we need to continue to commit to work behind.
Thank you. So I want to take a little bit different approach before zooming in, which is a lot of the conversation, has gone back to civil society. And one of the things I really appreciate about the Aspen Institute is this cross-sector approach at looking at the issues and finding ways to reach collective impact on the issues that we're facing. As a student of nonprofit, when you start looking at charts in a classroom around GDP and the percentage of resources in the sector, it's the smallest slice is the civil society or the nonprofit sector, and the largest pie really is the private sector, followed by government and then the nonprofit sector. So I feel like the private sector has the opportunity to play an important role given some of these conversations and issues that we're facing right now, because they have the size and scale and the reach, to address some of these questions and concerns. We saw some of that at the Super Bowl with some of these commercials and the conversations, and some of the CEOs of companies that are, taking on this corporate social responsibility to a different level of better governance and thinking about what their companies can do. Because ultimately, to tackle some of these issues, especially in these areas that you're talking about, it needs to be everywhere. It needs to be, of course, in your places of worship and your congregations. It needs to be in schools and colleges. We see the work that Interfaith Youth Corps and others are doing. It needs to be where you work. And your workplace can play a significant role in shaping cultures around inclusion and around these topics. Now, going more specifically, I think engaging the other is extremely important given this polarization that we have. But I want to zoom into, Pastor Bob Roberts and Imam Majid's project, My Neighbor's Keeper, is mentioned in the book, and an example that you've mentioned as well around this. But if you look at that project, it goes back to the question that as we're talking about reaching these communities, how do we amplify, scale, replicate that work in different communities, number one. Number two, who's stepping up to, again, support that initiative? If someone is taking this bold initiative now to go out to these communities that are not often visited, how do you do that? And then the third thing that I've gathered from those conversations with him is that you take a hit when you take that leadership stance. In terms monetarily, in terms reputationally, and it's not easy to provide allyship as well. And so then, how does everybody feel a sense of responsibility that when your church or synagogue or community center takes a stance, that everybody stands up and provides support to the people taking those stances? So, I think these questions need to be examined in that sort of way, but a tri-sector approach and a localized approach, will move the needle, hopefully.
So we're very lucky to have Rabbi Saperstein with us, who's going to offer some closing remarks in a few minutes. So I'm going to do kind of a two-part question, just so I can get two questions in. But this will be kind of your closing. But one is, I think, really pertinent to this conversation, which is like, how do we deal with the fact that it's hard to measure progress? That if you're talking about, hungry mouths, or if you're talking about reducing, HIV, you can measure those things concretely. How do you measure relationships in a way that corporations, private sector, funders can understand in the frameworks that they already have? I mean, that's like a constant challenge that I've encountered in this space. So that's one. That's my first part A. Part B is, although we call the report Pluralism, Peril, I'd like to end on an uplifting note. So I want you to each kind of end with what makes you hopeful in this space. And I'll flip it. And so Farhan, I'll start with you. So both the measurement question and then what makes you hopeful, and then we'll wrap up.
So again, in terms of the measurement question, it's a sector-wide conversation that's happening. The Monitor Group and large hedge fund managers that are now entering this space and want to be involved in philanthropy. The measurement is a question that takes up a lot of time and conversation. But I will say that again, looking at Dina's write-up about it,
Right.
That she has in the book. We'll talk about, again, looking at trust relationships and how do you actually start measuring. There are qualitative and quantitative measurements that can happen. And it's a process that has to get embedded within organizations. When you ask nonprofit leaders sometimes about measurement, they say, well, our mosque is burning and you want us to talk about measurement around impact and change management. Yeah. So part of it is also around that. But in a less crisis mode type of an environment, there is this question that if you're very clear about what you're solving for, and your theory of change is solid, and your interventions are evidence-based, then the measurement process becomes easier. And so our focus, at least, is when we work with nonprofits, is to define your theory of change, define your intervention, clearly define who your target beneficiary is, and how are you actually moving the needle on those pieces. And there's more and more literature coming out now that talks about looking at social change and creating benchmarks and measures around it, and that's available to people. In terms of hope, from a faith-based lens, we have a lot of hope. It's embedded in our DNA. Going back to this example around the executive order and the Muslim ban piece, when that happened, my heart sank pretty much, and had the same feeling after I was thinking back about 9/11 and the backlash that followed. But this time it was different. This time, when we turned on the TV, we actually saw people at airports, receiving and hugging people.
Bouquets of flowers.
That's right. And I see that image of two men holding their daughters on their shoulders, Muslim, Jewish, hugging each other, and a group of people praying at the airport, and a group of people surrounding them. Those are symbolic images of the solidarity and the allyship that we're seeing, and I think that's very powerful. It gives us a lot of hope. This gathering gives us a lot of hope, and so we see, that's where, and of course, the examples of the projects that are happening in this book give us tremendous hope.
Thank you, Farhan. George.
I'll be very brief. On the measurement point, my job at ADL is overseeing all the external programs that the ADL does on education, law enforcement, and the research and analytic work that our Center on Extremism does. The key to measurement and evaluation and programming, it really starts not how do you measure it, but before you even begin to conceptualize a program, building measurement in on the front end. So irrespective of the touches or the relationships or the outcomes that you want to generate from any type of initiatives, measurement can be built in on the front end. Coming in on the back end to say, did we affect a change here or there? What was our logic model? What was our theory of change? And how do we measure this in some way? If you're trying to look at it after the fact, it's way too hard. And I am not skilled enough in the social sciences to get into the details of it. But I've made enough mistakes to tell you, if you build it how you measure it on the front end, you're going to be able to get some data on the back end. And I think that for this conversation, that's the simplest way to put it. And I would add that if you look at some of the signature educational initiatives that the ADL has run, and has run for over a decade now, A World of Difference Institute, No Place for Hate, some of these kind of more large-scale initiatives that we run across the country. We reach over 1.5 million K through 12 students per year on these initiatives that are teaching about tolerance, inclusion, pluralism, conflict resolution. So these are multifaceted, multi-dimensional initiatives. ADL trains over 15,000 federal, state, and local law enforcement officers every year on implicit bias, civil rights, community policing, things that are fundamental to how the fabric of society can be woven more tightly together. The thing that I am optimistic about is that the work of organizations like the ADL, like the El-Hebri Foundation, and like the classes that my colleague here teaches across the country, there's waiting lists for those classes. There's a line to get a grant from the El-Hebri Foundation, multi-years deep. We have waiting lists at the Anti-Defamation League for implicit bias training that we can't keep up with. So the thing I am optimistic about is there continues to be a demand for civil society authentic messaging and resources in this space. So I am optimistic because people continue to raise their hands on the need for these types of initiatives. So to the extent that we can find ways to band together, to pool resources and energy to continue to supply those, I will continue to remain optimistic.
I actually just thought of one, which I think because ADL has such a long programmatic history, I think there could be some really interesting cross-sectoral learning between how you do evaluation, like the boring stuff, and Farhan's 300. The needs is that's the stuff that people don't want to focus on. That's not the leadership. That's not the visionary statement. It's like the nitty gritty that you have to do to get money. I mean, but I think that there could be some connections there. We can facilitate them. Chris, bring us home.
Yeah, come on home, baby. I led this small nonprofit of 15 people for 15 years or whatever. And I can't tell you how many times I heard, you don't fit in any of our buckets.
Yep.
So everything that's been said so far is spot on. But let me say this, the donors are not always right.
Yeah.
Doesn't mean I'm right, but the donors are not always right. And in so many ways, we are talking about the re-education of the donor community, about how to think about these things. And you have to build the metrics in from the beginning, and you have to think about the theory of change, absolutely. But Americans, in my experience, tend to worship at the altar of quantification. Mm-hmm. And they get intellectually lazy when it comes to qualitative metrics. Mm. What does that look like for my particular project? And that's the stuff that should be done up front in terms of X, Y, or Z projects. And there's thoughtful ways to think about it. And the point is that you do it together. My feeling with donors has always been, would you get past your bad self and stop worrying about the product at the end of 1 to 3 years and be known by your partner? Mm. Now, don't be known by the product, be known by your partner. At the end of the day, fundraising is investing in leaders. Mm. And it's usually the top leadership, the program manager, the country manager, whatever. Who are those leaders? Do they know who they are? Do they know where they're going? And there's a track record with them. Otherwise, they wouldn't be leaders. Look at their track record. I'm also have a hat on as advisor to the Templeton Religion Trust, and we're developing a philanthropic strategy to address issues of pluralism, et cetera. Believe you me, these things are in our minds as we're talking about them. In terms of optimism, I had the experience to speak on the border of North-South Waziristan in a madrasa, and then at a mosque in Syria before the Troubles. And I was kind of just like I am now, what you see is what you get. And at the end of it, both things, then they were Islamist type congregations, and I had a very devout young man come up to me at the end of both ones, and they said, Chris, we've never met a Christian, let alone a Christian American before. We've never heard anybody quite like you. Don't know a bucket to put you in. Didn't say that, but that's kind of the loose translation. And they said, you are so consistent with the prophet, peace be upon him. Why don't you finish the journey? Jump on board for the big win. And how do you respond to that, right? My response is always the same. I thank you so much for caring enough about my soul to talk to me directly. What a compliment. What a compliment. What a relationship. Now, I'm not going to become a Muslim. But because you said that, maybe I can share why I believe what I believe. And that's a different conversation. That's a multi-faith conversation. That gives me hope. Two quick examples that illustrate that from just the last couple of days. So on Facebook, I put this thing up on my Facebook page. And one of the relationships from going to North-South Waziristan is a guy by the name of Qibla Ayaz. Dear friend, dear brother in humanity, we are never going to agree on Isa al-Masih, Jesus the Messiah, as revealed in the Quran. And he is now the head of the chairman of the Council for Islamic Ideology in Pakistan. And he wants to respond on Facebook saying, we just developed a statement about minorities in Pakistan. I don't want to share it with you. But he puts it so everybody can see. And my Facebook friends are like the Star Wars bar scene. It's like the whole political and theological spectrum. So he's going out there and saying, hey, we want the world to know that we're doing this in Pakistan. Last night I had dinner with the chairman of, I can never say this right, Nahdlatul Ulama, NU, which is a 50 million Muslim organization in Indonesia. Thank you. Forgive my total American ignorance. What do you call a person who speaks one language? An American. The conversation we had and his comments, thinking about, they have a Jakarta Declaration that I need to review, but encouraging the Jakarta Declaration to be in conversation with the Marrakesh Declaration, to be in conversation with Qibla Ayaz in Pakistan and the Islamic Ideological Council, and with people, non-Muslims participating, that's the kind of dialogue that we need. And so I am profoundly hopeful that, again, in this moment of disruption, we can have these kinds of honest conversations without sacrificing the essence of our identity and without sugarcoating the direness of the situation. We can do both, and we can be mature, and we can love each other and be the best of America in a secular context, because we agree this is what American citizenship is, that this conversation takes place and everything else flows from it.
Thank you, Chris. We're sitting here. Are we staying here?
Yes.
Yes,
Do the
okay.
Q&A. Do you want
So-
to do the Q&A first?
Well, so I was going to not do Q&A because we're close to 11:30 now, and I want everyone to hear you speak. But so just join me in thanking the panelists. Thank you guys so much. We're going to stay here. Are we staying here? We're staying here. And Rabbi Saperstein is coming up.
I'm just going to make some brief closing
Okay.
comments. And first, these are three people who I admire greatly, who were the participants, and what an extraordinary moderator we have who does such wonderful work. It is, I found that much of what I had prepared before I walked in the door, they have covered. It was like George saw my notes, and you just, I couldn't agree
That's the
with.
former Homeland Security in me.
Yeah, he did see your notes. Yeah.
So I won't repeat the pieces that they have said so eloquently. Let me save one, which is how remarkable this book is. I mean, what George said, all of you alluded to in this is really an extraordinary document. So one question, and you may well have thought this, Merrill, you and I have not had a chance to talk about it. I haven't had a chance really to discuss this. What are the strategies and tactics we're going to use to take this book and its messages and get them out far more widely across the country? I can think of so many cohorts of leadership and activist groups, coalition groups who would learn from about how to do their work, organizing groups that would learn from how to do their works, groups that are trying to address issues of curriculum and education reform that would learn a great deal from doing it. So I hope we're going to be having those conversations, and conversations not just within Aspen, but with Aspen's broad circle of people to deal with that. Secondly, we all know coalitions of decency are indispensable to the work you do. You talk about minority groups. There's no minority group in the country, no matter how large it is, who's capable of single-handedly affirming the agenda, and certainly not the Muslim community, the Jewish community, and the smaller communities in the United States. And if you look back on the 20th century, if I can take a guess at some of the consensus views of the people gathered in this room, there is probably no victory in America that took place, but for a bipartisan coalition of decency on Capitol Hill and a multiracial, multi-ethnic, multi-religious coalition of decency in communities all across America. And one of the most frightening aspects of, you talk about an inclusive America, one of the most frightening aspects is not only at the kind of grassroots level where we're really worried, but at the leadership level about the breakdown of the sense of the commonweal, a sense of our being all in this together, a sense of bipartisanship, and those multi-coalitions that have been so indispensable for us. So we need to restore those coalitions. But one of the things that this book lives up very well is a dynamic that we're all seeing, which is we're at a moment in world history and in American history in which those who are the victims do not just want people to come as lone rangers and rescue them, but really want to be empowered to have a say on what the strategies and tactics are to address their issues. I really appreciated pieces in this book that really helped us think through what that would mean for this kind of work. And I very much, and also the, in other work that Aspen is doing, I'm sure there was interaction with the collective impact effort that Aspen is doing, but some of the lessons learned from those need to be merged with what we're doing to actually develop the strategies and tactics that will make a difference. Really appreciated the work on and the little back and forth that Chris so candidly and courageously put on the table, pushing back against not Al-Hibri, who does such extraordinary work, but the donor community more broadly here. But it does cut both ways, Chris. In other words, the qualitative capital, social capital created by groups often eludes the donors. It is true in the converse, needless to say, that so many groups, particularly smaller groups, particularly local groups, but even national groups, just don't get the whole concept of quantitative evaluation and impact. That's why some of the training stuff you do is absolutely so valuable. But I think I speak for every person in this room who says they know groups who are doing really valuable work, who if you talk metrics to them, it is like talking that other language. Yeah. They simply don't understand what you're, or why. Is it not self-evident the good we're doing? Look at all the people we're feeding. Look at the people we're teaching. Look at the people we're empowering. Isn't it self-evident why we deserve to have the kind of support we have? This is a really serious problem for the inclusive kind of society we're talking about how to bridge the gap here and develop things that bring us closer together on those issues. I'm intrigued by the issues raised in this study, which I think are so valuable, about resilience. And looking at J.M. Berger's work and George's piece in this, here really I was fascinated to look at that. We were over at another conference, and 300 religious leaders from around the world talking about many of these same things. And I raised in one of the times the study that Kasich had done about why people are attracted to Boko Haram. And they looked at the assumption that a lot of this came from what they were hearing in a mosque and their religious institutions, and found that it really wasn't so. A lot of it came either from, not surprisingly, social media, but a lot of it came from cultural institutions, from the extended circle of friends and extended family. And the question of how we intersect with those are issues that you've raised here, and we really need to think about it. I really hope, Meryl, there'll be some follow-up digging deep on that piece of it, because the question of resiliency in communities, whether we're talking white supremacist communities, whether we're talking about extremists, in any segment of our communities, how we actually intervene in a way to actually prophylactically protect about that and address it, and what is effective in terms of, we have examples all over the world about, people who have been radicalized and then come out of that, and the successes or lack of successes about how we reintegrate such people into our society. These we need to get into, and this book was honest in raising some of those issues in very helpful ways. Look, I think all of us feel that this is an extraordinary moment on the world scene in America. We see this escalating rate of hate speech on the social media, with the anonymity that goes with that, conflated with an extraordinary moment in history where the President of the United States has lifted some of the social and cultural constraints about giving voice to hate speech and speech that demonizes or dehumanizes segments of our society. And it has opened up something that is going to be very hard for us to put those constraints back on here. And we recognize the peril that this really brings us to, this recognition that hate speech and hate crimes are more than mere murders or beatings or assaults or efforts to dehumanize or desecrate property. These are crimes that are aimed at the very pillars of what makes America what it is, of our freedoms, of our inclusiveness, of our unity, of our e pluribus unum, out of many one. They seek to tear at the often frayed threads of diversity that bind America together. At this moment when we recognize how increasingly diverse America is. The statistics that show that, 10 years ago, in 2008, that 54%, only 54% of Americans still identified as Christian and white Christians in America. Already, today, 10 years later, it's 43%. We are changing at such a rapid rate. And the America that many of these people want to go back to is never coming back again. Here, that's what's at stake here. And that's what makes this book so valuable, Meryl, so constructive, so helpful, and so hopeful for us. This is really a significant contribution at this crucial moment of time. So I remember, Meryl, when the decision was made to undertake this second part of the project. I don't think any of us who were in the room at that time ever dreamed it would be done with quite the strength, quite the insight, and quite the success. So to all of you who are involved in this, congratulations and thank you. And to all of you, thanks so much for this rich conversation.
Meryl, would you like to adjourn us?
Yes, well, I just want to close. I want to close by thanking everybody for being here, and also a comment. I'm humbled by everything I've heard today from all of you, and also that I asked at the beginning that we not necessarily love each other, but we understand each other. I'm reminded of what Rabbi Hillel said, which is love thy neighbor, all the rest is commentary.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.